England, 1066. Rumours abound of invasion. All eyes turn south towards Normandy and its ruler, Duke William, who has long coveted the English throne. Then on the 8th of September, a massive invasion fleet is sighted off the east coast, led not by Duke William, but by the King of Norway, Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking. The man known to history as Harald Sigurdsson, or Harald Hardrada, was born in 1015 or 1016 in Ringerike, north of the city of Oslo, in modern-day Norway. His father, King Sigurdsson, was an insignificant ruler of Ringerike, a region in Buskerud in the Norwegian uplands, who is notable for marrying a fallen king's wife and adopting her son, Olaf Haraldsson, who became King Olaf II of Norway around the time of Harald's birth. Harald's mother, who is described as a generous and caring lady, was Æthelred Gudbrandsdatter, who had married Sigurdsson shortly after the death of her first husband, Harald Granska, who was a descendant of the Norwegian Fairhair dynasty and ruler of the Vestfold region of Norway, who was murdered as he slept in his foster sister Sigrid the Haughty's home, who he had hoped to marry to benefit from her wealthy estate. Harald's father, Sigurd, was baptized as a Christian in 998, and although he had no grand ambitions of his own, he was aware of his son's adeptness as a warrior, and whilst Harald's father was a modest, peaceful, but wealthy man, he was nonetheless supportive of Harald's warlike ambitions, and was aware of his son's relentless drive, and encouraged him to pursue his own purpose. In recent years, the paternal lineage of Harald's father has been questioned by some modern-day academics, as it is thought that his family tree may have been altered sometime after his death to further legitimize his descendants' claim to the Norwegian throne, which was a practice that was not uncommon at the time. According to the Icelandic sagas, both Harald and his half-brother Olaf were descended from the supposed first king of Norway, King Harald I, or Harald Fairhair, and it is said that Harald's great-grandfather was Sigurd Riese, who was the son of Fairhair. However, as no definitive evidence exists to verify the accuracy of many of the Viking sagas, the accuracy of Hardrada's family lineage is still debated. Although very little verified information exists relating to Harald's childhood, he was nonetheless described extensively by the 13th century Icelandic poet Snorri Sturluson, who depicts him as being larger than other men, with light hair and beard and a long upper beard, or moustache, and it is also evident that, like his half-brother Olaf, Harald would continue the Viking tradition of leaving his homeland in order to seek fame and fortune across the high seas. During the 9th century, Norway was made up of a number of small regional kingdoms that by the end of the first millennium had been unified under the rule of Harald and Olaf's ancestor, Harald I, or Harald Fairhair, but after his death in 933, fractured into smaller territories and kingdoms once again, controlled by jarls or nobles under Fairhair's descendants, who still held the Norwegian throne, including his great-grandson, Olaf Tryggvason, who did much to convert his subjects to Christianity. Then in the year 1000, Tryggvason was killed by the forces of his arch-enemy and brother-in-law, the pagan king of Denmark, Sweyn Forkbeard, in the Battle of Svolder, after which Forkbeard united the kingdoms of Denmark and Norway, where he installed the vassal jarls, or nobles of Lade, to rule over different parts of his newly acquired Norwegian kingdom. But despite this, Forkbeard ultimately died in 1014 in Lincolnshire, after invading England and dethroning its king, Æthelred the Unready. After this, Forkbeard's eldest son, Harald II, became king of Denmark, whilst his younger son, Canute, was proclaimed king of England, until he was driven out when Æthelred returned from exile in Normandy at the request of the English nobles. However, after the deaths of both Æthelred and his son Edmund Ironside in 1016, Canute became the undisputed king of England once more, and following this in 1019, also succeeded his brother as king of Denmark, and would later also rule Norway took parts of Sweden, Pomerania, and Schleswig, earning him the title of Canute the Great. By the time of Sweyn Forkbeard's death in 1014, Harald Hardrada's half-brother Olaf Haraldsson was around 19 years of age and was already a seasoned campaigner that had embarked on many travels and campaigns across the Baltic, England, and even Normandy, where he had even aided Æthelred the Unready in his quest to reclaim his throne from King Canute by taking the city of London and burning London Bridge. After this, in 1015, Olaf decided to return to Norway and attempted to reclaim what he saw as his ancestral birthright, the Norwegian throne, and no doubt making use of the wealth he had accumulated on his travels, left Normandy, where he had converted to Christianity, and landed in his homeland, where he declared himself monarch, in the process gaining the support of the 5 petty kings before defeating the Jarls of Lade at the Battle of Mercia in 1016, thusly confirming his kingship for more than a decade. Much of the reason for Olaf's successes was due to the fact that the king, Canute, had been indisposed in subduing England when Olaf seized the Norwegian throne, but finally in 1029 the Danish king amassed a powerful army, including Danish and English housecarls, and mounted an invasion of Norway, culminating in the naval battle of Helgeå in 1026, in which Olaf was narrowly defeated and later was forced to flee Norway in 1029 for the Slavic Finnish state of Kievan Rus, and later Sweden, as his nobles rebelled against him in support of Canute. The following year, after the death at sea of Canute's puppet Norwegian regent, Olaf attempted to retake the throne of Norway, and after amassing an army along with his young 15-year-old half-brother Harald, who brought 600 men to Olaf's banner, marched through Sweden towards Trondheim in northern Norway, where on the 29th of July 1030, Olaf, Harald and his men met a larger Norwegian force of peasant farmers and nobles loyal to King Canute, who heavily outnumbered them. After fierce fighting, Olaf received 2 wounds to his neck and knee, and whilst leaning on a rock, no doubt in a state of exhaustion, a spear was thrust up and under his chainmail coat and into his torso, before another warrior dispatched him with a sword thrust to the throat, meaning that before long, the former king's army was overwhelmed by their adversaries. But nonetheless, Olaf's men did manage to bury his body nearby, but the location of the exact site remains a mystery to this day. After their defeat at the Battle of Stiklestad, as it is now known, Harald, who had fought bravely by Olaf's side, no doubt with the help of his loyal followers, managed to escape the field and took shelter and succour on a remote farm in order to heal his wounds, and then, after recovering, travelled over the Norwegian border and across the Swedish mountains, before he finally arrived in the Kievan Rus kingdom, which was a state comprised of a loose federation of Slavs and Finns, then run by King Yaroslav I, otherwise known as Yaroslav the Wise of Novgorod, and his wife, Ingigerd Olofsdotter. Throughout the winter of 1031, Harald ingratiated himself within Yaroslav's court, becoming a military captain, and it was at this time that he first requested the hand in marriage of the king's daughter, Lady Elisiv, but was initially rejected, as he was not considered to be wealthy enough, and therefore did not meet the standards of her family, who were deemed prestigious within the royal courts of Europe. After spending several years in the Kievan Rus kingdom, taking part in campaigns against the Poles and local tribes, Harald, like his brother Olaf and many Vikings before him, realised that he needed money and fame if he was to attract enough men to his banner with whom he could win territory, marry who he wished, and climb the social hierarchy of Europe, with the ultimate goal of reclaiming the Kingdom of Norway. Therefore, in 1034, Harald, along with several hundred of his retainers, turned his eye to the rich and powerful Byzantine Empire and its capital of Constantinople, that the Vikings called Miklagard, where he hoped to earn money and renown as a mercenary in order to increase his chances of marrying his Lady Elisiv, who it is clear he was determined to wed. In previous centuries, the pagan warriors from the north had been the enemies of the Byzantine Empire. However, since the reign of Emperor Basil II, Christian Norsemen had been employed as close bodyguards, known as the Varangian Guard, within the Emperor's court, and it was perhaps with the goal of attaining such status himself that Harald decided to leave the Kievan Rus, with Yaroslav's blessing, and travel southwards towards the imperial capital. At this time, the Byzantine Empire itself was ruled by the son of a peasant, Emperor Michael IV the Paphlagonian, and the new Empress Zoe the Great, known as Zoe Porphyrogenitor, or Born into Purple, due to her having been born to a reigning emperor in 978. After finally arriving in Constantinople, it wasn't long before Harald's presence was noticed by the Byzantine military, as he was soon, according to the sagas, commissioned in 1035 by the state as a Varangian guard to serve in Emperor Michael's personal retinue, although some modern historians question whether he rose this rapidly, as the Varangian Guard were the Empire's elite troops. Whilst Harald was settling into his new life in the east, in 1035, King Canute died, and with the support of the King of Sweden and the Norwegian nobility, Harald's 11-year-old nephew, Magnus, the illegitimate son of Olaf II, and his wife Astrid's English slave, Alfhild, became Magnus I of Norway, whilst King Canute's son Harthur Canute became the King of Denmark. However, even though the Danes had largely been responsible for his father's demise, Magnus, acting on the advice of his councillors, chose not to go to war against the Danish king, earning him the nickname of Magnus the Good. In contrast to Magnus, Harthur Canute soon rekindled his hopes of ruling over Norway, and in 1040, war broke out between the two kingdoms. But when both men's nobles brought the kings together in a meeting on the border of their realms, the two rivals agreed that the lands of the first one of them to pass away would go to the other, and 2 years later, Harthur Canute died in England, meaning that without so much as fighting a battle, Magnus became King of Norway, as well as Denmark. By 1240, Magnus's uncle Harald had already proven himself to be an extremely able and fearsome warrior, as he had, according to Snorri Sturluson, become the leader over all the Varangians, and by this time had campaigned in the Emperor's armies in Asia Minor, or modern-day Turkey, forcing back the Arabs to the river Euphrates in northern Iraq, capturing numerous Arab forts and settlements in the process. According to many accounts, Harald also played a crucial role in capturing Palestine at this time with relative ease, without fire nor by the sword, and allegedly oversaw the signing of a peace treaty between the Byzantines and the Muslim Fatimid Caliph, in which Christians were allowed to travel to Jerusalem, but as the journey was dangerous, Harald is said to have escorted pilgrims to the Holy City, where he no doubt visited the city's holy shrines and sites, and may have even helped to reconstruct the Church of the Holy Sepulchre that was built around the cave where Christ was entombed and then rose from the dead. We are also led to believe that Harald was considered to be a strong and charismatic military leader, as during his campaigns and travels he amassed a significant following, personal fortune and fleet, in which he took to the seas and attacked pirate shipping around Greece, and in 1038 Harald also joined a Byzantine campaign in Sicily that for 200 years had been controlled by the Muslims and ruled as the Emirate of Sicily. It was during this campaign that Harald came into his own and marked himself out as an exceptional military commander, as on one occasion he and his comrade, the Norman mercenary William Ironarm, faced difficulty in breaching the walls of a Saracen stronghold. However, the invaders overcame the fortifications when they decided to use wax and sulphur on splintered pieces of wood fixed to the back of small birds, which, when released, instinctively sought sanctuary under the roofs within the castle walls, thus starting many fires and leaving those inside with no choice but to surrender. Despite Harald's plundering expeditions, it is written that he was also merciful, sparing those who surrendered and were willing to take him as their new leader. But by March 1041, a Norman Lombard revolt in opposition to the Byzantine domination of southern Italy culminated in the Battle of Olivento, at which the Normans, led by Harald's former ally William Ironarm, defeated the Byzantines, making the confrontation the first major Norman Lombard success against the Greeks in the battle for control of Italy, marking the beginning of Norman rule in Sicily and southern Italy. After this, the rebellion in Italy continued with confrontations such as the Battle of Monte Maggiore in May of 1041, where Harald and the Varangian Guard once again faced the Normans, who at this time had famously adopted the tactical use of cavalry and were able to overpower the Byzantines on the battlefield. But shortly afterwards, both Harald and the Varangian Guard were recalled from Italy to fight in Bulgaria alongside Michael IV at the Battle of Ostrovo in late 1041, against a force of rebels who had risen up against the Empire. Then, after Harald and his fellow guardsmen had returned to Constantinople, his patron, the Emperor Michael IV, died on the 10th of December 1041 and was replaced by his adopted son, Michael V, who ruled as co-regent with Michael IV's wife, Zoe Porphyrogenita. However, after ascending to the throne, Michael had Harald imprisoned on a charge of defrauding the Emperor's treasury, as it was commonplace for the Varangian Guard to loot the Emperor's treasure after their death, although there was no evidence that Harald was guilty. In contrast to this, another account states that Harald was imprisoned because he had requested the marriage to a fictional niece of Empress Zoe named Maria, whilst yet another states that he defiled a noblewoman, and yet another that he was imprisoned for murder. Nonetheless, whatever the reason was behind his imprisonment, it has been suggested that the new emperor must have been suspicious of Harald, not least because of his loyalty to the previous emperor, Michael IV. After this, Michael V made matters worse when he banished his stepmother Zoe from her position of co-empress in 1042, as he was under the impression she had attempted to poison him, imprisoning her on the island of Principo, and afterwards proclaimed her sister Theodora as her successor. This act proved unpopular with the people of Constantinople, however, who then rose up in revolt against Michael V, dethroning him, freeing Harald in the process, and reinstalling in his place both Zoe and her sister Theodora as co-rulers. But after a brief 2-month reign, Zoe married Constantine IX Monomachos, making him the new king alongside Theodora and herself, whilst the dethroned Michael was blinded, castrated, and sent to a monastery in line with Byzantine tradition, possibly by Harald's own hand. By this time in 1042, Harald was around 27 years of age, and was evidently becoming restless to return north to his homeland, even publicly stating his desire to do so. But this was opposed by Empress Zoe, who was unhappy about Harald's intentions, as she is said to have been in love with him, although it is probable that she merely wanted to retain his services in her elite Varangian Guard. But, whatever the case, Harald retained his goal of travelling back to the Kievan Rus to marry Æthelred, after which he intended to carry on northwards to his homeland of Norway. Despite the Empress forbidding him to leave her service, Harald chose to do so anyway, and one evening, after finding 2 ships, he, along with a small number of retainers, cast off from Constantinople harbour. But whilst entering the Bosphorus Strait that connects the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, the ship accompanying his own was destroyed under the weight of a massive chain that spanned the harbour entrance. Despite this, Harald managed to enter the strait and navigate north into the Black Sea, and after months of travel, finally arrived back in Kievan Rus in late 1042, and shortly afterwards married Æthelred, with her father Yaroslav's blessing in the winter of 1043 to 1044, which was largely due to the vast amount of wealth he had accumulated. Yet, despite his riches, it is still significant that Harald was allowed to marry the king's daughter, as Yaroslav's other children were married to European kings, which at this time, Harald was not. Another possible condition of marrying Æthelred may have been that Harald was a source of information on the defences of Constantinople that were famously considered to be amongst the most formidable in the world at the time, and it is therefore surely no coincidence that shortly after Harald's arrival in the Kievan Rus, Yaroslav I launched an attack on the imperial city, in which he was defeated and forced to withdraw. However, there is no record of Harald having taken part in this campaign in 1043. Then, in the summer of 1045, Harald, along with his wife, said their goodbyes to Yaroslav I by departing the city of Novgorod and setting sail across the Baltic Sea, before finally arriving in Sigtuna, Sweden, in late 1045 or early 1046, in a ship which, according to accounts, almost sank under the weight of gold it contained in its hold. Whilst in Sweden, Harald secured the support of its king, Anund Jakob, to whom his wife Æthelred was related, but as well as this, Harald also joined forces with a pretender to the Danish throne, Sweyn II Estridsson, the grandson of Sweyn Forkbeard, who had been kicked out of Denmark by King Magnus. And so, after their alliance was forged, the three joined forces and conducted raids on the Danish coast. Despite the close relationship between Sweyn and Harald, the relationship frayed when King Magnus in 1046 offered to share the throne of Norway with Harald if he would in return share his great wealth with Magnus, who was all but bankrupt, and as a consequence, both men shunned Sweyn in the negotiations, much to his displeasure. After this, Harald ruled half of Norway with King Magnus I, but when his co-regent died without an heir in 1047, Harald then inherited the remaining lands of Norway and also declared himself to be King of Denmark, even though Magnus had appointed Sweyn as his heir apparent before his death, culminating in the two rivals going to war with one another in what would prove to be a long drawn-out conflict from 1048 to 1064. During this war, Harald sacked the vitally important Danish trade centre of Hedeby in 1049. That was also the best protected and most populated town in Scandinavia, after which he then went on to attack the Danish city of Aarhus in 1050, when the Holy Trinity Church was burned to the ground, before narrowly evading capture in Jutland, where, in an attempt to escape, he lightened the cargo of his ship by throwing captured booty into the sea. But when this failed to deter Sweyn's advance, he instead chose to have his captives thrown overboard instead, which had the desired effect. As well as his war against the Danes, Harald also had to contend with discontent from his own nobles, in the form of the descendants of Hakon Sigurdsson, who had formerly controlled much of northern Norway as a vassal of Denmark in the 10th century, and whose family line was now headed by Einar Thambaskelfjord, who had married Hakon's daughter, and after the death of King Canute, had done much to place Magnus the Good onto the Norwegian throne. Then, in an effort to deal with the powerful Einar, who was now trying to raise an army, Harald in 1050 offered to meet his rival at a farm near Trondheim, where the two would discuss a resolution to their dispute. However, Harald proved himself to be a ruthless and cunning politician, as when Einar arrived with his son and heir at the meeting, the king's men ambushed them, and moments later both lay dead. But after hearing of her husband and son's murder, Einar's wife rallied a force and attacked the farm, from which Harald was lucky to escape. Now that he had subjugated the Norwegian nobility, the king once again sought to claim the Danish throne by resuming his war against Sweyn, and the high point of this conflict then came in 1062, when both met at the naval battle of Nysa, which had been pre-arranged between Harald and the Danish king to take place on the Nysen River near the modern-day Swedish city of Halmstad on the 9th of August. The confrontation that followed proved to be typical of naval battles in the Viking era, in which longships with long narrow keels and flat bottoms were deployed that could carry up to 35 men and were easily manoeuvred by two oars on either side of the stern or rear of the ship. Whilst on board, archers peppered the enemy vessels with arrows and infantry waited to board the foe's ships. It was with a fleet comprised of as many as 300 of these iconic vessels that Harald arrived at the Nysen River. However, when he did so, Sweyn and his own fleet was seemingly absent from the battle site, prompting Harald to perhaps naively order his non-professional soldiers, which made up half of his fleet, to go home, whilst his remaining men raided the Danish coastline in customary Viking fashion. Then at dusk, Sweyn, along with his fleet of some 300 ships that had been lying in wait in a concealed position, ordered an approach on the Norwegian forces, who they now outnumbered by 2 to 1, and in response to this Danish advance, Harald and his Norwegian chieftain, Hakon Ivarsson, bonded their ships together in a tight formation, which was then mirrored by Sweyn and his second-in-command, Finn Arneson, until finally the two fleets joined battle in a hailstorm of arrows, under which thousands of Vikings locked horns in hand-to-hand combat. Ultimately, much to Sweyn's despair, Harald's army was victorious, although he almost lost his life in the process, with many Danes escaping to fight another day, and in the celebrations that followed, credit for the Norwegian victory was given to one of Harald's earls, Hakon Ivarsson, who had outflanked the enemy during the fighting and caught them off guard. But despite this, the victory was soured by the fact that Sweyn had managed to flee with his life after being captured, although to Harald's displeasure, he discovered that his rival had possibly been freed by his second-in-command, Hakon, who had previously served under Sweyn's command prior to changing sides, resulting in Harald banishing him from Norway as a result. As neither king had been able to secure a decisive victory in this long and bloody war, a peace treaty between both sides was signed in 1064, in which both sovereigns kept their thrones, with Harald ruling Norway and Sweyn Denmark, with each retaining their respective kingdoms' existing boundaries, and importantly, Harald was also formally recognised as King Harald III of Norway by his kinsmen and former enemies. While King of Norway, Harald implemented a number of economic policies, such as the introduction of standardized Norwegian minted currency, which was viable for international trade, and moreover, the king's impact on Norway, due to his relationship with the Byzantine Empire, led to the expansion of Norwegian trade with countries such as Scotland and Ireland, the Kievan Rus, as well as the Byzantine Empire itself, which helped to stabilize and enrich the kingdom's economy. In conjunction with his economic reforms, Harald also endeavoured to promote the spread of Christianity across his kingdom by bringing in bishops, priests and monks from abroad, building new churches and repairing damaged chapels across Norway in order to spread the word of God, both in and beyond his homeland. Whilst perhaps one of his most lasting and important decisions was, according to the sagas, to found the city of Oslo, which acted as his base of operations and remains the capital of Norway to this day. In contrast to this, Harald also imposed harsh punishments on his people that would earn him his nickname of Hardrada, meaning stern or hard ruler, such as ordering the maiming and killing of those who withheld their taxes, and he also kept his people in check through the use of his personal army, or hird, whilst he also increased the power of the monarchy during his reign by enforcing a policy which stated that only the king could keep his own hird, giving Harald increased power over the lords of Norway, as they could not raise armies. After solidifying his grasp over the kingdom, Harald then turned his attention across the North Sea to the rich and fertile lands of England, which the Vikings had been plundering for centuries, starting with the earliest raid on the island in 793, when the Vikings attacked the monastery of St. Cuthbert's on the holy isle of Lindisfarne in Northumbria, a description of which was carved onto the so-called Doomsday Stone. These raids saw the Vikings labelled as barbarous, heathen men in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, but regardless, they continued to attack the island mercilessly over the coming decades, marking the beginning of the Viking Age, and after many years of incursions, scores of Vikings immigrated to the British Isles, taking up residence in England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales, and assimilating with the native population, particularly in the north of Britain, where many towns and villages still bear Viking names. Harald's interest in England was first kindled when he received an invitation from the unseated Tostig Godwinson, brother to Earl Harald Godwinson of Wessex, to help him claim back the Anglo-Saxon earldom of Northumbria, which he had been banished from because of his unpopularity with the population of Northumbria that was largely of Danish and Norwegian stock or heritage. During his rule in Northumbria, Tostig, who was a southerner, used violent tactics to subdue the northern populace and quickly became a despised figure amongst the local population, as well as the kingdom's nobility, including Edwin, Earl of Mercia, and his brother Morcar, who hated the Godwinsons and had designs over Northumbria for themselves. Eventually, this discontent against Tostig reached boiling point in 1065, when a rebellion broke out in the north against the hated Earl, which had been encouraged by Edwin and Morcar, who pressured the rebels to petition the aging and childless English king, Edward the Confessor, who sent his right-hand man, Tostig's brother, Harald Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex, northwards to negotiate with the Northumbrian rebels. Unwilling to face the reality of a civil war with Edwin and Morcar, Harald Godwinson refused to back his own brother, and instead persuaded Edward the Confessor to side with the rebels, resulting in Morcar being elected as the new Earl of Northumbria, meaning that the humiliated Tostig was forced to flee England and seek sanctuary in Flanders. By this time, King Edward was gravely ill, meaning that the English throne would soon be contested by a number of powerful dukes and kings, most notably Harald Godwinson, Earl of Wessex himself, Harald Hardrada, and most famously, Duke William of Normandy. But despite these various claims, upon his deathbed, Edward the Confessor named Harald Godwinson as his heir, and so when the king finally died on the 5th of January 1066, the English Earl was crowned King of England the following day, meaning that when William heard the news of Godwinson's coronation, he flew into a rage and began preparations for war. At this time, Tostig was still in Flanders at the court of Count Baldwin V, who then lent him a number of ships, with which he conducted raids on the south coast of England and East Anglia in May of 1066. But then, whilst pillaging Lincolnshire, Tostig was defeated in battle by the Earls Edwin and Morcar, and so he then fled to the safety of Scotland under the protection of his friend, King Malcolm III. It was whilst he was in Scotland that Tostig first communicated with Harald Hardrada, and it is said that the banished Earl even travelled to Norway to Harald's court, where the Norwegian king was so impressed with Tostig that he formed an alliance and began planning their invasion of England. Although some state that Tostig did not travel to Norway, and the two men formed their alliance after Harald's landing in England. Harald Hardrada's claim to the English throne was based on an agreement between the former Danish ruler of England, King Harthacnut, and King Magnus the Good, which stated that the last man living would inherit the other's lands and titles. However, historians now believe that England did not form a part of his agreement, so when Harthacnut passed away in 1042, the Saxon, Edwin the Confessor, was crowned King of England, with the backing of the kingdom's earls. But nonetheless, both King Magnus and Hardrada continued to claim the English throne regardless during their reigns. On the other hand, William of Normandy's claim to the English throne was based on the fact that his grandfather, Richard II of Normandy, was the brother of Edward the Confessor's mother, Emma, making him Edward's cousin. But as well as this, he also claimed that he had reached an agreement with Edward the Confessor in 1051, which stated he would be crowned King of England after Edward's death. Back in Norway, Harald Hardrada, who was 50 years old in 1066, is said to have been apprehensive about seizing the English throne, and had it not been for the persuasion of Tostig, he may very well have not been willing to attempt an invasion of England. But it is certain that if the Norwegian king had misgivings about the undertaking, he did not have them for long, as his invasion preparations must have begun in the mid to late summer of 1066 at the latest, as accounts tell us that by this time, Hardrada had amassed a massive army of 10 to 18,000 warriors, at the head of whom he then set sail for England in August of 1066. Over the coming days, Harald's invasion force was ferried across the North Sea in 250 to 300 longships, first stopping in Shetland and then Orkney, rallying more men to his banner, including several thousand Scottish troops, courtesy of Tostig's ally, King Malcolm III of Scotland, although it is not known for certain if Tostig himself sailed from Norway with Harald, or if the two met on the coast of England. Nonetheless, it is generally accepted that the two joined forces in the vicinity of the River Tees, after which they conducted raids on Scarborough and other Northumbrian towns en route to the capital of the north, the city of York. After sailing down the River Humber and disembarking at the village of Rickle, the Viking army then progressed towards York, but when they came in sight of the city's walls near the modern-day village of Fulford on the 20th of September 1066, Harald and his host were confronted by a 3,000 to 4,000 strong Saxon army under the command of Tostig's arch-enemies, Edwin, Earl of Mercia, and Morcar, Earl of Northumbria. In preparation for the forthcoming engagement, Harald deployed Tostig, along with his Flemish mercenaries, to the right of the Viking line, opposite Morcar, on the Saxon left wing, possibly as he knew Tostig would fight hard against his arch-rival, whilst on the Viking left, Harald and his Vikings faced off against Edwin, who deployed his forces at a right angle between the River Ouse on the Saxon right and marshes on their left, meaning that the Vikings could not outflank them, although they occupied the high ground. Hostilities then commenced when Morcar's Saxons charged Tostig's Flemish troops, who struggled to contain them. Then Harald's Vikings swept across the battlefield and dispatched Edwin's right wing, in turn splitting their Saxon opponents into two factions, decimating their formation, and with the English hemmed in and surrounded on three sides, they soon fell back into York, whilst Edwin and Morcar escaped unharmed, until 4 days later the city capitulated on the 24th of September, with Harald taking up to 150 child hostages from prominent families in the city. News of the Viking victory at Fulford soon reached King Harold Godwinson, who instantly moved north from London to Yorkshire to meet Harald Hardrada, staggeringly completing an almost 200-mile march in only 4 days, rallying troops as he went, before arriving in Tadcaster, west of York, on the 24th of September. Although it is one of the most famous battles in English history, the exact site of the Battle of Stamford Bridge is not known for certain, but it is generally thought to be east of the River Derwent, southeast of the town, now known as Stamford Bridge. Despite the size of the Saxon army, it seems that Hardrada had no idea of the magnitude of the threat which now faced him, as his own force, although similar in size to Godwinson's, was divided between his own host as well as the Viking fleet moored at Rickle, meaning that he had left York undefended, culminating in King Harold and his Saxons reoccupying the city on the morning of the 25th of September, before marching eastwards towards Hardrada's Vikings, who were encamped on the eastern bank of the River Derwent. It is clear that Harald was caught off guard by the speed with which the English king had marched northwards, as he had left around a third of his force to the south, guarding the Viking longships at Rickel, along with the majority of his men's armour and shields, meaning that they would have to fight the English, wielding for the most part only their swords and axes. Legend has it that when King Harold's Saxon host attempted to cross a small wooden bridge that spanned the River Derwent, they were halted in their tracks by a lone Viking, armed with a giant double-handed axe, who, according to accounts, slaughtered up to 40 Saxons who dared fight him. Nonetheless, this fearsome opponent was ultimately brought down when a lone Saxon swam under the bridge and thrusted his spear up between the wooden planks into the Norseman's loins. It is said that after crossing the Derwent, Godwinson, in the hope of pacifying his brother, rode up to the Viking host before the battle and offered Tostig the rights to his earldom and half of all England if he returned to fight by his side. Although this offer was not accepted, and instead Tostig chose not to betray Harald Hardrada, and subsequently the battle known to history as Stamford Bridge commenced. Then, after forming up opposite one another, the Saxons and Vikings clashed in a brutal and desperate hand-to-hand struggle, but ultimately, the Vikings' lack of armour and shields cost them dearly, as the Saxons were able to break up their enemy's line, until in the very thick of the fighting, Harald Hardrada was struck in the neck with an arrow and mortally wounded, continuing to cut down his foes until exhausted, the King of Norway was finally slain. Then, following Harald's demise, Tostig took up the leadership of the dwindling Viking army, but was soon killed himself, after which the Viking rearguard arrived on the battlefield, led by Eystein Orri, who was betrothed to Hardrada's daughter Maria, who, upon discovering that his king had been slain, raised Hardrada's fallen banner and began a counterattack, which almost breached the English line until Orri was himself killed and his men routed. After the battle, the remaining Norsemen slipped away under the cover of darkness, but were pursued to Rickel by Godwinson, who allowed Harold's son and successor Olaf to return home, if he promised never to invade England again, to which he agreed, and so the young Viking set sail for Norway, where he became king, along with less than a tenth of his father's original force of 10,000 men, and only 25 of the 300 ships which had arrived in England. Despite his famous victory at Stamford Bridge, Harold Godwinson was not gifted much time to enjoy his victory, as his army had been greatly weakened by the long march and desperate fight against Hardrada, and then, only 3 days after the Saxons had defeated the Vikings, the Norman invasion force, led by Duke William of Normandy, finally landed on the coast of Sussex to the south, meaning that the English king was faced with a second long march and battle that famously proved to be too much for him and his men, as they were defeated at the Battle of Hastings on the 14th of October, 1066, marking the end of Saxon England and the beginning of Norman rule. Although it is likely that the Norman invasion itself would have been unsuccessful if Harald Hardrada had not invaded England, it is perhaps telling, or even ironic, that the Saxons at Stamford Bridge defeated one of the last great Vikings in Harald, when they were themselves in turn defeated by the descendants of the Vikings, or rather Norsemen, after whom the Normans are named, and who would ultimately transform the history of the whole of medieval Europe, from the British Isles to Sicily, and even the Middle East. Even though the truth of Harald's character is largely unknown, as much of the information we have on him was written long after his death in the Icelandic sagas and the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, the narrative of him being an outstanding and fearsome warrior and skillful tactician seems to be consistent with his many achievements and accomplishments, and despite his failure to claim the throne of England, Harald is, today, seen to be one of the last of a dying breed of Vikings, who travelled the known world in search of glory, and in doing so, died in battle, as he had lived, with his sword in his hand and his brethren by his side. What do you think of Harald Hardrada? Was he a brutal and tyrannical king who only sought power and wealth, or was he one of the last true Viking heroes who, like his forebears, lived as if every day was his last, and died like a Viking in the very thick of his enemies? Let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.